Hello and welcome to the On Philosophy lecture series. This is a series that is organised by The Philosopher, a long-running public philosophy journal based in the UK. This is the final day of a long series of digital dialogues that we organised this autumn, beginning on the 7th of September and running on a weekly or twice weekly or sometimes 5 times weekly basis until today. So today is a 3-event day, which was organized to coincide with the 3 meals, at least if you live in the UK. So this morning we had Eva Meyer, who's a Dutch philosopher, talking about listening to animals at 8 a.m. This evening we have Sil Coe, who's an American philosopher, speaking on human beings and being human. And for our kind of lunchtime session at 2 o'clock UK time, although I guess for anyone in America, maybe you're having your breakfast now, we're delighted to have Gary Francione, who will be talking about his soon-to-be published book, Why Veganism Matters. So actually, the philosopher did do a special issue on animals, the other animals. That's Christine Korsgaard's phrase. That was published earlier this year. And I'm going to put a link to a couple of articles from that special issue, which we've put up today onto our website to coincide with this day. So just to introduce our speakers, the hosts for the event will be Darren, Chetty and Adam Ferner, who run the Do You Even Vegan podcast. Darren and Adam both operate very at the sort of intersection of academic and public philosophy. They both published a book last year called How to Disagree, Negotiate Difference in a Divided World. And they are hosting all 3 events today. They will be in conversation today with Gary Francione, who, as I mentioned, has a book coming out, published in January by Columbia University Press, called Why Veganism Matters, The Moral Value of Animals. Gary is a distinguished professor of law and Katzenbach Scholar of Law and Philosophy at Rutgers, as well as a visiting professor of philosophy at the Lincoln University in the UK. He's well known for his criticism of animal welfare law, the property status of non-human animals, and for his theory of animal rights. Gary is obviously a hugely established and respected and controversial figure within the field of animal studies, animal ethics, and animal law. So I think he's a really exciting person to have on, and I'm certainly looking forward to reading his book when it is published early next month. So I think I've probably said everything I need to say for now. Gary, Adam, and Darren will be in conversation for probably around half an hour. During that time, I'm going to send a few things over using the chat function, links to Gary's website, links to the book, links to Adam and Darren's podcast, their websites, a few things to do with the philosopher. And as and when a question kind of arises, please do send it to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screens, preferably keeping it fairly short so we can get through as many as possible. So I think that's everything I need to do. So hopefully Darren, Adam, and Gary will magically appear on your screens and we can get going.
Magic.
Hello.
Oh, yes.
All right.
Thank you, Anthony. Just a very quick extra bit about the Do You Even Vegan podcast that Adam and I started. In fact, we started it earlier this year. It's a podcast exploring veganism personally, politically, and playfully. We're trying to look at issues and debates within veganism. So certainly in the mainstream press, the vegans are seen as this sort of homogenous group who all agree on everything. And yet within vegan debates, that's clearly not the case. But we're also interested in thinking how veganism relates to other social justice movements. If indeed we see veganism as a social justice movement, which again might be an issue for debate. We usually talk whilst we're eating. We're breaking from that tradition today just because of times. We've got our cups of coffee here, and we, as Anthony mentioned, Adam and I have also written the book How to Disagree. So we're kind of interested in talking about talk as well as talking about veganism. and we're both coming from a sort of background of an interesting philosophy. So to have Gary here as a philosopher who is a vegan, who does an awful lot of talking both to vegans and non-vegans is quite a luxury. We're very excited about that. I'm going to hand over to Adam at this point.
Yeah, so again, yeah, just to echo Darren's thanks. I'm going to start with a kind of possibly a brutally rough summary of Gary's position, just so that we can hit the ground running, and then we're going to have some questions afterwards where Gary can tell me where I've gone wrong. So basically, and this is kind of based on the recent book, which Gary, when is it coming out?
I think towards the end of January, Adam.
Towards the end of January, and it's called Why Veganism Matters. Is that right?
Yeah, the subtitle is The Moral Value of Animals.
The Moral Value of Animals. Okay. So in this book, he's engaging with people who care at least a little bit about non-human animal welfare. So people who think unnecessary animal suffering is wrong, and that we have some moral responsibility to treat them humanely, in inverted commas. If you're someone like this, Gary says, then you're committed to being a vegan, and there can't be any half measures. And claims about unnecessary suffering, for example, are kind of beside the point. And as I understood it, his argument revolves around a distinction between person and thing, and the moral universe is comprised exclusively of these two things, and there's nothing else. This stands in contrast to what he sees to be the default position, which a lot of people kind of assume is the case, that non-human animals are somehow quasi-persons. And interestingly, building on Bridget Brophy's work, and this is the first time that I've seen her invoked in this setting, although I'm a big fan. So building on Bridget Brophy's work, he argues that our understanding of personhood rests not on the capacity for future-orientated, morally interested consciousness, but on sentience. So having a mind is sufficient for animals to be persons. In presenting his argument, he takes issue with Peter Singer and Tom Regan, who he thinks are damagingly inconsistent in their application of animal rights-based arguments to eating practices. And that's kind of our starting point. And I'm going to, so I think, Darren, you've got kind of the leading question.
Yeah, and forgive me, Gary, if this is a question you've heard put to you many times. It's around the idea of consistency. In your work, you put a premium on consistency, and you say early on in this book, I'm going to argue that if you think that animals matter morally, then you're committed to being a vegan. There's nothing extreme about it. Indeed, I'm going to argue that what is extreme, in the sense of being extremely inconsistent, is to believe that animals matter morally and yet not be vegan. And you criticize what you call vegans.
Oh, or I call vegans.
No, he called that. That's not my term.
That's my term. Yeah, yeah. That's
I apologize, because I was going to say how much I like that term.
I'll take the credit.
Yeah, for being inconsistent and excessively permissive. So the question is, and I guess your answer is going to be no, but do you think you're placing too great a demand on moral agents? Is there too high an expectation regarding consistency? Are there other existing spheres where there's this level of consistency is expected of people? And I wonder whether there's a distinction, which I haven't noticed, about you talking in terms of how we'd make an argument. I know you have a legal background, so you'd make an argument in terms of progressing the law, to how you might make an argument in chatting to someone who you meet in socially. Or do you think that there's nothing sort of significantly different about those two examples?
Well, I don't think, I mean, I think in areas where we're talking about human interests, where we're talking about fundamental rights, I mean, we do take an absolute position on murder, rape, child molestation, and things like that. When we're talking about animals, we're talking about imposing suffering and death on them. So we're not talking about some sort of insignificant infringement on them. We're talking about taking their lives and killing them, using them and killing them. So I think that we are fairly consistent when we're talking about the fundamental rights of human beings. I think we're pretty clear that, that we have absolutist type views. And what I'm saying is, if animals matter, then we certainly can't. I mean, this idea that we can continue to use them as long as we do so humanely, which is a meaningless term because they're property and the standards for animal welfare are always going to be low. That's a central part of my work, is that the level of animal welfare is always going to be low. And so that really is not an acceptable approach. And so when we're talking about animals, because I get this as we were talking before when we were chatting to do our camera tests and sound tests and whatnot, I get the question fairly often, well, aren't you taking a purist position? The answer is, yeah, I take a purist position on murder, on rape, on child molestation, on slavery. I take a purist position on a bunch of things that have to do with fundamental rights of humans. I just think that animals matter morally, and that they have to have this one right, the right not to be treated as property. I'm not talking about giving animals all of the rights that humans have. I'm talking about giving them the one right, the right not to be property. But if we recognize that one right, we would basically have to abolish, not regulate, but abolish all institutionalized exploitation. And we'd have to take care of the animals that are presently here, but we shouldn't continue to produce domesticated animals. Domestication itself is morally problematic, as I discuss in the new book. But the second part about the legal argument, if what you're asking me is, let me ask you what you are asking me. Are you asking me that we can take incremental steps in the law, and therefore we should take incremental steps when it comes to animals? Or was that what you were asking me? I wasn't sure. Darren?
I think what I was asking you, and let's see if I'm clear. Partly this is coming from having looked at this book, Advocate for Animals, an Abolitionist Vegan Handbook, which you co-authored.
Right.
There's work in there about, for instance, logical fallacies and informal fallacies. So it seems to me that clearly, fallacious reasoning in philosophical work and legal work is something that is to be avoided. But I wonder whether sort of fallacious thinking or using of fallacies in how we communicate is not something we're actually going to get rid of, so that being able to identify a fallacy isn't necessarily going to have any impact in how we persuade people.
I actually, my experience is very much the opposite. Very, very much the opposite. I find that when somebody tells me, for example, well, but using animals is natural, and then I get into the discussion about what natural means, or and I talk with them about various fallacies that we identify in that book. I find people respond to that really very well. I mean, people respond. I mean, it depends how you're talking to them and how you're talking, and if you're talking with them and you're engaged, in a discussion, I find people respond to that stuff very, very well. I mean, for example, I will frequently, when I'm talking with a group of students, ask them if they're familiar with the case of Michael Vick. And Michael Vick was an American football player who got into a great deal of trouble because he was running a dogfighting ring at some property that he owned. And he ended up getting into some legal issues over that. But that happened in 2007. 13 years later, Michael Vick is still known for his dogfighting activities, and people really still hate him. People who like animals still really despise Michael Vick. If he shows up anywhere, there's always a protest of animal people. So if I'm talking to a group of young people, I can start off by saying, look, do y'all know Michael Vick? Yeah. Why, what do you think about Michael Vick? He was a terrible guy. Why is he a terrible guy? And then, in approximately 90 seconds, somebody will say something along the lines of, well, he imposed suffering on animals and it was completely unnecessary. It was gratuitous. And I say, well, fine. So we all agree that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. Right. Anybody in the audience disagree with that? And nobody ever puts up their hand. And I say, okay, fine. But and if that means anything, it means we can't impose suffering or death for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Yeah, that's right. Absolutely right. And then I say, okay, fine. Why are you all not vegans? How many vegans are there? And then 3 hands go up. And I say, well, why aren't you all vegans? And then we'll have a discussion that sometimes goes on for hours. I mean, sometimes I get booked in to talk at a university for an hour and I'm there for 3.5 hours because we talk. I mean, people don't really think about this stuff. They have sort of a response, and it's like, well, it's natural, or it's traditional, or it's, this, or it's that, or doesn't God want us to do it, or blah, 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 and once you sort of respond to those things and say, well, look at the Bible, look at Genesis. In the beginning, everybody's a vegan. Nobody's killing anybody. It's only when there's a breach of the covenant that between God and humans that the killing begins. And so, when you confront people with this stuff, it's amazing how little people, including people who like animals, who care about animals, have ever thought about these things. I think that people want to be consistent in how they think about, they may not want to be consistent about everything. And they may be willing to tolerate a certain amount of inconsistency in their lives when it comes to certain moral issues. But I don't think that most people want to be inconsistent when it comes to issues of fundamental rights, where death is involved.
I'm gonna jump in here with a poorly formed thought, so bear with me if that's all right. So I suppose the thought relates to mitigating circumstances, and I agree that obviously there are some things that are fundamentally wrong. Murder is wrong, right? But of course, and this is a point that Darren made to me recently, obviously we have just, inverted commas, just wars. Now, I wouldn't murder anybody, but there are certain situations where people feel like it's okay and it's mitigating circumstances to do something which is fundamentally wrong. And the demands of consistency that you're placing on people, and I am a vegan, so I'm kind of persuaded by certain arguments which stop me eating animals, among other things. But I do think that there is something about requiring consistency in the face of mitigating circumstances and understanding exactly how extensive those mitigating circumstances are. So obviously, for me, a middle-class person who is financially secure to a certain extent, I don't have to worry about the certain food choices. But maybe that's not, that clearly isn't true of everybody. Where do you think the mitigating circumstances lie in responding to issues around veganism?
Well, look, what I always say is that it's never justifiable. It's never morally okay. It may be excusable in some circumstances where there's a compulsion that mitigates the culpability. And so, frankly, I think 99% of our animal uses don't involve any sort of compulsion. As a matter of fact, the point I make in the book is that our only use of animals that involves any sort of compulsion, arguable compulsion, is with respect to using animals to find cures for serious human illnesses. And frankly, I think if we took animals seriously, that would be the only discussion we'd be having. We wouldn't be eating them. We wouldn't be wearing them. We wouldn't be exploiting them in other contexts. But let me address the specific context in which you raised the issue about you're economically secure. I think, look, poverty is bad and it affects all parts of people's lives, not just their food choices, but everything else. Would you be willing to say that, that there are mitigating circumstances where if somebody kills somebody else because they need economic resources and they take somebody else's property and they use violence to get that property, they engage in robbery, you might want to sort of take that into consideration in your punishment decision, but I don't think you would take it into consideration. I don't think it would certainly be dispositive of your determination about culpability, certainly moral culpability. I think one of the things I talk about in the book that Darren held up a few minutes ago that Anna and I discussed in that book is that the vegan movement has really been horrible about trying to bring veganism to places where there's lower economic, there's fewer economic resources. We have a lot of food deserts here in the United States. I've spent a lot of time over the years working with people in food deserts to try to bring healthy food choices to those folks. The one point, we have a website, howdoigovegan.com, and we have tons of recipes on there that we've developed ourselves with people to try to sort of show how cheap vegan food is to eat. That, you know, you don't have to buy all this processed stuff. I don't eat that stuff anyway. I mean, it's processed food. It's got a lot of salt. It has very little nutritive value, and that you can really be a vegan much cheaper than, you know, you can eat plant-based for far less money than, you know, you can eat animal products. And so, you know, but I don't think that being economically deprived justifies your killing someone, whether human or non-human. It may mitigate it, but it still doesn't. It may mitigate the culpability, but it doesn't remove it.
I'm Darren, if you want to.
Yeah, let me just think. My concern with the consistency is less about, you know, wanting inconsistent argument. I think it's more in the bigger question of sort of how does change happen? How does social change happen? So if I could just say a little bit more about that. I guess when I read your work, I agree with what you're saying. I'm then left with the question of, well, if veganism or vegans have the best arguments, why isn't most of the world vegan? So what is it? It's not for lack of good arguments. It's not for clear reasons that vegans are still, you know, globally such a minority. And I guess I think then about, I guess I'm more involved with anti-racism and thinking about how simply having the argument that racism is wrong was never sufficient to bring about that where progress has occurred. There's been mass protest, there's been pressure, there's been all kinds of attempts to sort of stigmatize the bad behavior. There's often imaginative work. And I wonder how you see the vegan movement making progress, because you say, well, we can sit down and have this discussion and people are more thoughtful. Do the people who you reason with go away and become vegan?
Many do.
And are there enough of us to do that work to shift things?
Well, look, I mean, I think a big problem we have is the animal movement. I mean, as a matter of fact, I think the animal movement is the biggest impediment to veganism being more widely accepted than it is. I mean, we've got a zillion of these charities. I mean, they're basically businesses that are selling the idea that there's such a thing as compassionate exploitation. So, you know, I mean, I encounter this all the time. As a matter of fact, this is the idea, the thing that I encounter most from people who care about animals who aren't vegan, is they say, well, I understand what you're saying, but, you know, I've got this group or that group telling me that, you know, as long as I'm reducing my intake, or as long as I'm buying higher welfare animals and higher welfare animal products, then that's okay. And I think that, you know, I don't think you can underestimate that. When you have Peter Singer, you know, the quote, father of the animal rights movement, end quote, you know, calling consistent veganism fanaticism, or, you know, you have him taking the position. I mean, as I just pulled some quotes this morning. You know, Singer saying it's pretty difficult to be a conscientious omnivore and avoid all of the ethical problems. But if you were really thoroughgoing and eating only animals that had good lives, that could be a defensible ethical position. Or he says, I know some people who are vegan in their homes, but if they're out at a fancy restaurant, they allow themselves of not being vegan that evening. I mean, so if you've got the father of the animal rights movement telling you that as long as you are eating animals that have had reasonably pleasant lives and you know, relatively painless deaths, it's really okay, then it's just a matter of sort of finding the right level of welfare, which is why we now have stores that sell higher welfare animal products, because there's a movement out there that says we discharge our moral obligations if we consume animals that are higher welfare animals. I mean, you know, I think this is a big problem. And this is why, you know, the purpose of the book is to say, look, if you really care about animals, if you think animals matter, if you don't think animals matter, if you don't think we can have moral obligations, then I'm not going to convince you in this book that that's the case, you know, that's not the case. I'm talking to the person who thinks that animals do matter morally, and that we do have moral obligations that we owe directly to animals, and that and that we can never discharge those obligations as long as we're continuing to exploit them, particularly in situations where there's absolutely no compulsion. As I say, I don't think it's okay even if there's a compulsion. If you and I are on a desert island and we're starving to death and I kill and eat you, it's not justifiable. It may be excusable given the sense that, there's been a compulsion there that mitigates my culpability. It's not justifiable. I think the same thing applies when we're talking about animals. But I also think the animal movement has done a terrible job in terms of trying to make veganism something that's accessible to everybody, because it is. And I think that we've done a terrible job in terms of, I very rarely meet animal people who have ever spent time in inner cities trying to get healthier food choices and try to bring, the one thing I've learned, I've been teaching at Rutgers in Newark, which is one of the most depressed American cities. And when you're talking, that's meaningful. It's a really depressed American city. And the one thing I've learned in working in Newark is that people are very, very interested in health issues. That many of them don't have cars, so they don't have access to the supermarket, so they end up paying, 3 times what they would pay for a can of beans if they had a car and they could go to a supermarket. There are issues like that, and there have been lots of efforts to try to get healthier food in those areas, and I think that's really important. But I think we need to make veganism accessible to everybody and emphasize it's easy and it's cheap.
I'm just going to, if it's all right, jump in there. Also, I'm slightly conscious of time because we've got some questions as well that would be important to make sure that we get to. But I guess on the point of consistency, there seems to me to be a little bit of a disanalogy in the way that you're talking about the ease with which one can become a vegan and the ease with which one can avoid committing murder. Right. So, and this kind of goes back to the previous point that you made that obviously, I would draw the line at killing somebody. Why don't I draw the line at, in fact, I do draw the line at killing animals and eating them. But the fact is that the framework that we're embedded within, capitalist and white supremacist and patriarchal, is such that, and of course, obviously, human lives are lost because of that framework, but at the same time, I can kind of go around in my day-to-day life without murdering anybody. But it's much, much harder for me to go around in my everyday life and not use something that is in some way dependent on an animal product, whether it's a car or whether it's the clothes that I buy. Veganism obviously isn't just a dietary thing. So it's trying to understand exactly where the consistency is called into question and what the mitigating circumstances are. Because you could kill me on an island and it'd be excusable perhaps. I'd be upset. But in this situation, it's much, much harder to be vegan. Like the food, I think, so I guess that was just my poorly formed thought.
No, it's fine. We kill in this world more than 70 billion land animals a year for food. And nobody knows the number of fish. The lowest estimate I've ever seen is 1 trillion. So we're talking about a huge number of animals. So the byproducts are all around us. They're in the plastics and the computers that we're using this morning. They're probably animal ingredients or animal byproducts in that plastic. You can't avoid it. You can't live a perfect vegan life, but you can whenever you have a choice in terms of participating directly in animal exploitation. You do have a choice. And also, I would say this to you, Adam, that the situation is not as clear cut with humans as we think it is. That is, our living. I have long been involved in the Jain movement, and the Jain spiritual tradition. And the one thing I've learned in being a Jain is that all of our actions have adverse consequences, for somebody, and so therefore even if the vegan product or whatever products you're consuming, there are human beings who are producing those products, and some of those human beings get injured and killed in the production process. We build roads. We know that human beings are going to be killed on that stretch of road, and depending on how fast cars are going and things like that. So the bottom line is we can't avoid harm to humans. We can't avoid harm to animals, but and we may not understand the outer limits of our moral obligations. But the easy question is, when we're deciding what to eat, what to wear, what shampoos to use, things like that, when we're making those decisions, if we choose not to participate directly in animal exploitation, then I think that's something we have a moral obligation to do. And I also think as more and more of us do that, then I think the demand's going to go down. And that, I mean, one of the reasons why there's animal products and everything is because it's remarkably cheap. Slaughterhouse byproducts are remarkably cheap to buy. One other comment I wanted to make: capitalism sucks. There is no doubt about it. There is no doubt about it. But I think it's wrong to suggest that capitalism is, I mean, every socioeconomic system we've ever been familiar with in the history of humankind, animals have been exploited. And so, yeah, capitalism does it in an arguably more efficient way, and I'm using that in a negative, not positive way, but it, does it in a more efficient way, more mechanized way. Although, non-capitalist systems have also had intensive agriculture. I think, one of the interesting things I've been playing with recently is that in many ways, our treatment of animals involves a sort of a problem for Marxism, because Marxism talks about morality being part of the superstructure that relates to the substructure. But animals have been exploited in every single system. So it seems as though we're making a moral decision that is separate from the economic substructure. So I think, I don't think you can, I don't think you can lay blame at capital. I mean, I think the problem is anthropocentrism. And I think that's the problem. And I think that's what we have to deal with. So but anyway, a long-winded way to answer your question.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier, Gary, about the sort of failure of I think you called it the animal movement, but about going into inner cities, into areas, and making sure that veganism is sort of practical. And that's something that really, really interests me. I guess there's been, and as you know, there's debates around veganism in relationship to Black and brown populations and communities. Yep. And there's often, we've been very keen on Do You Even Vegan to invite vegans of color onto the show. And I guess my own interest in this is the extent to which veganism disrupts some traditions, and that I'm quite happy with that, frankly. I think there's a lot of traditions that need disrupting, because they're not founded on just principles. But I wonder whether there's something about marginalized communities often having a particular relationship to some traditions, and indeed even to some cuisines, whereby by hearing a white male professor, and we know that these are the ways that sometimes people are sort of categorized and thought about, is seen as just another example of trying to interfere with their cultural practices. Now, clearly, I don't agree with that. I haven't tried to keep hold of cultural practices myself, but I do think it's a real problem to wrestle with in terms of the practicalities of how we expand veganism. And I wonder what your thoughts are on how we negotiate that.
My experience has been, because I have, I was a tenured professor at the University of Pennsylvania, which was, when I was there, a very almost exclusively white place. And I decided to leave in part because of the lack of diversity. So I left my tenured position at Penn and I went to work at Rutgers, which at the time I went to work at it, was a very sort of identified as a very sort of left-wing diverse community. It had a very, very diverse student population. And I've had a lot of students of color over the years. And what I find is when you encounter that idea, which you do, You encounter this idea, well, this is, imposing, this is sort of a problem. You're imposing these colonial norms on people and blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. But, I never hear people say, well, wait, you can't talk about equality for women, or you can't talk about, other sorts of things, because there are cultural traditions that reject that. Again, it becomes question begging, because we treat animals differently. So, you're not going to get an argument if you're making an argument to somebody that female genital mutilation of children is a really bad idea, even though it's a cultural tradition. You're not going to get people saying, wait just a minute here. You can't say that, because that's a tradition, and we think that that's a tradition that and you're criticizing it is wrong. But when you say, you talk about veganism, then people will say, that's problematic. Well, what's the difference between talking about killing animals and talking about female genital mutilation of children? If it really begs the question. It assumes that animals don't have moral status, and that they're not equal for the purposes of not being treated exclusively as a means to an end, exclusively as a resource. And that's the problem. And so, now again, how do you have that discussion? I've had that discussion probably thousands of times with students over the years who have raised that question. And I confront them with this. I said, well, wait a minute now. You're also, you're a member of this community. You talk about equality of humans, equality of women, don't you? Yes, of course I do. Well, there are certain traditions in that community that are very, very much opposed to equality for women. Yes, but those traditions are wrong. Yes, okay, fine. Then why are those traditions okay when it comes to the exploitation of animals? And the only explanation for that is because you don't think animals matter morally, which is, that's your position, that's fine. Or you don't think that you don't think that they matter morally. You think that it's all right under certain circumstances to treat them as things. Well, okay, if that's your position, that's your position. But you should acknowledge that, and not try to. One of the things that I find very upsetting about these sorts of discussions is that people try to use animal exploitation, or the defense of animal exploitation, as some sort of virtue. That that this is a virtue. This is a good thing for us to continue to do because it respects people's traditions. And the answer is no, I don't think it's a good thing. In the same way that I don't think it's a good thing to respect people's traditions when it involves sexism or misogyny or racism or other sorts of discrimination. So just as I would not defend those sorts of things, I don't think it's a good idea to defend animal exploitation or to try to turn animal exploitation into some sort of virtue. I just don't. But I better say, I've had lots of experience in dealing with this, and I find people don't look. It's all about creative, nonviolent education. And, so you don't, I mean, when you're talking with somebody who's saying, hey, this is my tradition, you talk to that person, but well, what does that mean to you? And, I mean, these are not elevator pitches. You can't make them in 20 seconds. You need to be able to explain to take people along on sort of a little journey here. But I find that it works really, really very well.
So would you say that vegans need to be more upfront about the fact that veganism is culturally disruptive or disrupts tradition? I think
vegans need to educate themselves generally about a whole range. And part of the problem is that the animal movement has been very reactionary over the years. I mean, it's not a political movement at all. As a matter of fact, I don't even like calling it a movement. I mean, a movement, suggests that it's going forward. I think it moves backward. I mean, one of the reasons why I was telling Anthony this morning that I started doing this work in the early 1980s, and I was involved with PETA when PETA was about 10 people big. And, and then we eventually had a split over a number of issues, one of which was sexism. That PETA thought it was all right to promote sexism. This I'd rather go naked than wear fur campaign, which they started in 1989 and got worse. And now it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's always been ridiculous, but it's gotten worse. And so I think that, the animal movement has been really bad about seeing the relationships between human exploitation and non-human exploitation. I mean, the whole point is we otherize animals, and we otherize animals but we also otherize humans. And most of the time when we're otherizing humans, we're using our otherization of animals as the template, as the model for otherizing some group of humans. I mean, if you think about it, there's not been one group of humans that we have discriminated against where we have not sought to justify that by analogizing them to animals. And one of the points I make in the new book is, think about it. If we got rid of animal exploitation, I mean, I don't think this is the way it's going to work, but if we got rid of animal exploitation, we would no longer have that template of it's okay to treat this group of humans in the way that we treat them, and to disrespect them and to disregard their fundamental rights because they are like animals. But we've done that with every group, with people of color, with Jews, with everybody. As a matter of fact, I wrote an essay on this on Medium recently, and I used some posters, like from the Second World, from before the Second World War, where when the Nazis were building the whole case against Jews, they would analogize them to rats, and there was all this imagery of Jews as rats and stuff. If we didn't have that template, then we wouldn't really be able to sort of as easily sort of make discrimination somehow natural because we've dehumanized some group of humans. I mean, so I think the animal movement has done an absolutely horrible job of the relationships between human and non-human exploitation. One of my best friends on the planet is a woman named Sue Coe, and she's an artist. She's British, and she lives here now. But Sue, I don't know if you're familiar with Sue's art, but Sue is just a terrific, and I mean, she's got stuff in the Tate, she's got stuff in the Met in New York. I mean, she's a significant artist. And one of the reasons I love her work, which hangs all over my house, is because she does she addresses racism, she addresses sexism, she addresses, all of these things, and animal exploitation. And she sees these things as all related. It all involves the otherization that is the root of the problem. So yeah, I mean, I think we've done a terrible job. And the number of times I've had animal people, and I recently got involved with an argument with some group of people, Anonymous for the Voiceless, because they have very reactionary, very right-wing views. And we got into an argument because they were saying that, that the animal movement should be focused on animals and not on human rights. And they were talking about, there was one of these people was talking about, using prisoners for experiments instead of animals and things like that. And I said, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? These things, you can't, I mean, if you're talking about using prisoners in experiments, this is fundamentally, morally screwed up. And you really need to sort of rethink these issues. But the number of times I've had animal people say to me, it's about animals, it's not about humans. I don't want to hear about humans. I don't like humans. It becomes sort of a misanthropic sort of thing. That's where look, I agree. We got a hell of a lot of ways to go before we turn the world vegan. I agree with you 1,000,000%, man. I've been doing this for like 40 years almost, it's been a long haul. But I think we've done a horrible job. But I think we could do a lot better job if we thought clearly about this. And basically we rejected all of these animal groups who I think are they're just useless. They're worse than useless because they make the situation even more difficult.
I'm gonna jump in there. Sorry, I just again conscious of the time. So we've got 15 minutes left and a lot of questions. I'm going to try and incorporate some of them together. Just also as a kind of preview of the conversation later with Sol, we're going to be covering similar things to what Gary is talking about in terms of the human animal distinction and the problems that I think arise as a result of that. And not now, but at a later date, I'd be really interested to know Gary's thoughts on that distinction as it plays out in Sol's work. But to focus on Stacey Nielsen, I'm going to combine your question with Steph Harsveld and Peter Orr's question, and sorry for brutalizing these if that's what I'm doing. But basically, I suppose the thought in which is kind of common to these is whether or not, Gary, as you say, you've been working on this for 40 years or so. Do you see an appreciable difference in the way that people are vegan? I mean, a rise in veganism, in ethical veganism, And do you see an appreciable difference in the way that, for example, Peter Singer's work is understood? And how might this also interact with another shift, which is grown to prominence, certainly in the popular media, about the climate emergency? So it's basically, it's a question about movement and progress, and should we be hopeful?
I think first of all, you said we've got 15 minutes left. That's your time deadline. I'm willing to do this for hours if you want. Hours and hours. I do think there's been progress. And I think there's been progress, but it's been outside of the organized movement. I think that, one of the things we've been trying to do building the abolitionist movement is to make it clear you don't need organizations, you don't need, that basically what you need to do is to educate yourself so that you can educate other people. And we've got people all over the globe now who are doing, who do this, vegan tabling, and they talk with people in very creative, nonviolent ways. And I do think that there's some progress. I think that what I find sort of interesting and somewhat depressing is our lives have changed in the past year as a result of this pandemic. And the pandemic, like most pandemics, the one we're dealing with now, like most of them, are zoonotic. And they relate to our relationship with animals, our use of animals. And even if we're not consuming the animals directly, the animals that we are consuming are in contact with these other animals that have infections and blah, blah, blah. And, I haven't been hearing as much as I'd like to hear from people about how maybe we're going to get a vaccine that's going to allow us to sort of have a relatively normal life again. But the reality is just a matter of time till the next pandemic and then next pandemic and these things are never going to go away as long as we're eating animals. And, they're never going to go away. And it's not just a matter of factory farming. Factory farming is particular, but it's basically eating animals is a problem. And it's always going to be a problem. We're always going to have these illnesses. And also the whole issue with climate change. I was very excited when Extinction Rebellion got off the ground because a good friend of mine was one of the organizers of it. And I was really very excited because I thought that they were going to make central to their point that animal exploitation, that we needed a vegan world if we wanted to avoid climate catastrophe. And it quickly didn't become that. We're talking about you're going to have citizens committees, and the citizens committees are going to, have to decide what way. The reality is the science is clear. The science is absolutely crystal clear. If we do not reduce animal consumption by 75 to 95%, and that ain't Meatless Monday. That's like, we're talking about a worldwide reduction of 75 to 95%. We will be unable to avoid climate catastrophe. And I find it troubling that, it seems that all of these movements just get appropriated. They get appropriated and they become very reactionary very quickly, almost immediately. Why that happens, it's not, I have some ideas, but I think it's an economic thing to a great degree. But I do think that we ought to be focusing on veganism, both as a moral issue. It's destroying this level of violence. The level of violence that we have come to accept as natural is pathological, in my judgment, and is destroying us. This level of the fact that we celebrate violence 3 times a day. When we put stuff into our mouths, we talk about peace, we talk about nonviolence, while we shovel the products of violence into our mouths and wear them on our backs and use them to wash our hair and stuff like that. And so I think that, we need to, so for moral reasons, for health reasons. The baby boomer generation, people in my generation, we're getting old now. We're going to, we're going to destroy the healthcare system because we're going to bankrupt it because, we've all got illnesses that we get from eating all of these animal products and climate change. All of these things, we have pandemics, all of these things point in one very clear direction. Stop it, cut it out, just get rid of it. It strikes me as just such a remarkably easy thing to do. It is, people always say to me, isn't it hard to go vegan? And I would say, no. Do you eat fruits? Yeah, love fruits. Do you eat vegetables? Yeah. Do you eat grains? Yeah. Do you eat beans? Yeah. Do you eat seeds and stuff and nuts? Oh yeah, I love that. Good. Just keep on eating that stuff and eat more and take out the decomposing flesh, the cow mucus and the chicken ova. Just cut that out. You're already eating, a lot of vegan stuff. Just eat more of it. It's nothing weird about it. People say, well, nutrition, I always love it. I'm sure you guys get this too. People say, well, what about the nutritional thing? Look, you're sitting there eating this garbage that is killing you. And now all of a sudden you're interested about nutrition. The bottom line is you can learn everything you need to learn about vegan nutrition in about half an hour if you're a slow reader. This is not rocket science. And so, I think that we need to do a better job. Part of the problem, Adam, is we got a movement out there that talks about baby steps being a good thing. Well, as long as you tell people baby steps is okay, baby steps are okay, they're going to take baby steps. That's just what they'll do. And so what I find is if you're clear with people and you're unequivocal about it, I think you get a much better reaction. Not from everybody.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. And this obviously is something that Darren and I have spoken about quite a lot, especially in relation to how people disagree. I don't know, Darren, if you want to come in there, because in terms of talking about how you came to veganism. Although I am also aware that we do have a lot of questions, so for all speakers, if we can keep it as brief as possible, that'd be great.
Well, just to ask Gary, given that on the podcast we like to talk about the sort of personal elements of veganism as well. Obviously, from your day job and for talking, in forum like these, you might be sort of prepared to be in battle mode. Whether you're going to encounter a hostile question or a hostile audience, and you've thought enough about it to have the responses. But I wonder about your sort of day-to-day social life. If it's not too prying a question, and feel free to say if it is, but whether you find that the need to sort of surround yourself with people who are vegan, or whether you're with non-vegans and then sort of arguing with them a lot, and how that sits with you in terms of how you live your life and how you experience, companionship, friendship, etc.
Well, I look at it as I take every opportunity I can to be with non-vegans, because I know I don't have to say anything. In a matter of 10 seconds, someone's going to raise that with me, and it's going to give me an opportunity to educate yet another person and get another person involved in a discussion about veganism. I don't mind that. And I also don't see it, when people sort of ask me, the plant, what about plants? Or wasn't Hitler a vegetarian? Or that sort of stuff. I know that angers a lot of vegans. It doesn't anger me at all, because when someone's talking to you about whether Hitler's a vegetarian or whether plants, are sentient, I view that as being an indication that they got nothing better. They have nothing better to say, and they're really struggling with this. And so it's an opportunity for me to get into their heads, basically, and try to explain to them that, and try to discuss veganism with them. So I actually, social life has been a little weird the past year, given that I've been teaching online since March. But on the other hand, I had a seminar in animal law and ethics, and I was expecting maybe 10 students. I got 36. And we had lots and lots of discussions about veganism, and it was clear that the students were very, very interested in this. And I'm not saying everybody agreed with me, because they didn't, but and it was great because they didn't all agree with me. So we had an opportunity for, it doesn't help if everybody agrees with you. So we had a lot of opportunities for discussion. But no, enjoy is the wrong word, Darren, but I welcome opportunities to talk to people about this. I think it's an extremely important moral issue, and I think that many people, maybe most people, don't want to lead a violent life. And what I always explain to them is, being vegan is not sufficient for leading a nonviolent life, but it's necessary. And so you got to do more, but you got to do at least that.
I'm going to jump in with a few more questions from the floor, if that's okay, and again try and tie them together as well as I can. So I suppose the ones that I'm looking at are focused to carry on this theme on ways that we can pursue this discourse most effectively. So Tom Gale Batten asks what you think about the use of language like cruelty, abuse and suffering in a kind of, I mean, like this subjective emotive language, and whether or not that creates rhetorical problems. And similarly, I mean, this isn't really the substance of Hannah's question, but what are the problems of also allying with, for example, positions like David Benatar's anti-natalism? I mean, I don't know if you're, I feel that you'll be familiar with that position. So what are the ways that we can best persuade people? Because I feel like you've had you've got a very strong line, and it's kind of like unequivocal. This is the way that I see the world. If you believe this, if you're going to be consistent, then you have to be a vegan. And I guess this comes back to Darren's point that it does feel quite sometimes domineering or dominating in a conversation if you come on in that way. And I think the idea of people working from specific subject positions as a white man, I think that engaging with certain groups in a certain way is one has to be aware of one's position, which I think you acknowledge. So yeah, this is it's I guess just a question about how do you navigate that tension specifically between your particular social position and the nuances of the conversations that you're having without being overly dominating.
Well, but I mean, you could say the same thing if we got involved in a discussion about if having a group of discussion with a group of people who think that arranged marriages are a great idea, for example, or that certain sexual practices involving children are acceptable, and you take the position it's not, do you come across as domineering? I guess maybe, but that's going to be true no matter what discussion you're having. And as I say, what I always try to do is to say, look, you take positions which are no different from my positions, except you take them when it comes to human rights issues, and I'm taking them when it comes to animal issues. And if my position on animal issues are problematic, then your position, for cultural reasons or for whatever whatever sorts of reasons we're talking about, if they're problematic for those reasons, then your positions are also problematic. And the only difference is your positions deal with humans and my positions deal with, my positions include humans, but also deal with non-humans. And so therefore, we have a fundamental disagreement, which I think at base basically involves speciesism or anthropocentrism, that you accept certain anthropocentric or speciesist views, and I don't. And so the fact that I don't accept those views doesn't mean that my positions are domineering. It means that I don't accept those views any more than your positions are domineering because you don't accept certain forms of exploitation when it comes to humans. And I think that, again, it goes back to what I said a couple minutes ago. I think that attempt or that sort of move in an argument is an attempt to sort of make animal exploitation some sort of virtue. And I think that's the problem, is that we're saying, well, animal exploitation really isn't all that bad. It's not like human exploitation, and it's really not all that bad. And so therefore, why are you telling groups of people that they really ought not to be engaging in these things because their cultural practices matter more than the lives of the animals? And the answer is, well, I think that's a serious moral question that needs to be explored. It can't be just brushed off. We can talk about it, but we can't just sort of say, well, the cultural traditions matter more, because there are all sorts of cultural traditions that involve all sorts of discrimination. And if we're going to reject those things when it comes to in the human context, then we need to have a reason for why we don't reject them when it comes to the non-human context. And I think that's part of the problem. I mean, I really think that that's part of the problem. And I think that I mean, we could get into a discussion, which we don't have time for, which maybe we could do some other time, to talk about sort of identity politics in terms of the role that identity politics plays in moral and political discourse as a general matter. And I actually think it's had a really problematic effect and impact in all sorts of ways. But that's a discussion for another time. But I do think that, I do think that these questions all basically can be reduced to disagreements about speciesism and anthropocentrism and about the moral value of animals. And that really what the questions assume is that animals have a lesser moral value. So therefore, traditions, even traditions involving non-necessary uses of animals, those traditions can outweigh the animal's interests in life. I don't think that that's a morally defensible position, and I'm willing to discuss it with anybody, but I don't think it's a morally defensible position. Go ahead.
Yes, unfortunately, yes, we've timekeeping is an accessibility issue, and we have run out of time. But it has been incredibly interesting talking to you about this. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been lots of fun. And as I say, I've got that website, howdoigovegan.com. It's got tons of easy, cheap recipes for people who are on a shoestring or who don't have time. And also, I'm fairly accessible. I've got that Facebook page, and I try to respond. I get like zillions and zillions of things, but if people ask me, if they ask me questions, and they're seeking to engage me and not just sort of dismiss it in a, if they're really wanting to engage it on a serious way, I'll be happy to do so. And
so that's for all the people who've got questions still to answer in the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm really happy to have done it, and I've got a piece coming out in The Philosopher, which I'm very, very happy about, which I think will be out. I think Anthony said it's going to be out sometime in January, and it's basically discussing all of these things, and one of the things we did not get to, which was the problem of the property status of animals, which is unfortunate, but we didn't get to it.
And Darren, did you had final thought?
No, well, no, I mean, there were a lot of good questions in the chat, so apologies if we didn't manage to get to yours. And it just felt like there was a lot more to cover. And that wasn't because Gary was giving overly long answers, but just that they were very rich answers that required more time. So thank you very much to Gary and to everyone.
Yeah, I'm happy to do, if you want to do a monster session of 3 or 4 hours, I'll do it. I'm up for it. I'll be happy to do it.
100%. Yeah.
I really mean it, guys. I really mean it. I'm a vegan, longtime vegan, all sorts of energy.
We'll get you back on. That'd be great.
All right. Fantastic.
Well, yeah. I mean, when we're back doing, in-person events, if Gary ever finds himself over in the UK, perhaps we can set up the marathon day, make a full day of it with a few people who contribute, and I think that would be a exciting prospect.
I have participated in these seminars where you have a few people and we have a presentation, and then there are and it goes on for hours, and people sort of discuss in a seminar way. Sometimes we break up in groups and stuff. We need to have more discussion about this, because part of the problem is the animal groups like to keep things very simple, and there's really very, very little texture in a lot of, the animal groups don't have an interest in discussion. They have more of an interest in slogans and whatnot. But I do think that that's something we could do and have fun doing. I would enjoy doing it. I've done it before. I love it.
Cool. Well, it's been extremely entertaining and provocative, and certainly sat around with my sister and partner. We're gonna talk long about this for the afternoon. So
and if you're not a vegan, why don't we Zoom later on, and we can for several hours, and you will be. We'll get you there with your sister and your partner and anybody else you want. But anyway, no, I've enjoyed it immensely.
I think it's fair to say that we all care about the moral status of animals, but I think we're subject to acrasia. Is that the word? The weakness of will in the moral domain. So maybe your arguments will help us to shore up that those moments where some things seem more important than others. So.
If I can have 30 seconds, I want to tell you, when I first became a vegan, I didn't know what a vegan was in 1982. I had been a vegetarian. I did not know that you could live without animal protein. And I became a vegan in 82 when I first heard the word. And for a while, I missed the thing I used to eat a lot of was ice cream and cheese pizza. And I mean, and I ate a lot of that stuff. As a matter of fact, it's remarkable I've lived this long. And so the one thing that, kept me from wanting that cheese pizza was I was thinking, is there anything I really want badly enough so that I'm willing to participate in the separation of the cow, the mother cow from the calf? Because I don't know if you guys have ever seen that up close in person. It's hideous. I mean, I have been in slaughterhouses, I have been in factory farms, and I mean, I've seen a lot of bad stuff in my life. But one of the most horrifying things I've ever seen is how a cow mother reacts when you take her baby away from her, given that she's a mammal and she's gonna have a very similar response to the response that any mammal has. They get really upset, and they are upset for days. And I always would think every time I passed by Ray's Cheese Pizza and Ray's Pizza in New York City, and I would get that hit of cheese pizza, I would always think, for 10 seconds, I would think, should I have a piece? And then I would think, do I really like this enough so that I'm willing to participate in separating that calf from the calf's mother? Because if I am willing to do that, then I'm a superficial human being who really is not of any value to the planet. And I just basically kept on walking. But just think about it. I mean, it's a weakness of will, but it may be difficult for us, but just think of how difficult it is for them if you're not. You might think veganism is difficult for us, but think about how difficult it is for them that you're not. That's my parting thought.
Thank you, Gary. That's a powerful thought. Thank you again, Darren and Adam. You've been super. And we've got one more event this evening, UK time, this afternoon, Gary's time, which is Silco, who with her sister Afko co-wrote an influential book on veganism. And
I'm sure they'll disagree with me.
Well, we'll see, but there's certainly some threads in the conversation today, which I'm sure will become the central elements of the discussion later. So I'll put up a little slide for that when we sign off, which I guess we'll do now. So thank you, Gary. Real pleasure. And yeah, as Gary mentioned, his lengthy article on animal personhood will be coming out in The Philosopher early next year. A couple of people have asked whether this conversation will be available to view, which it will be, and also Darren and Adam are going to be doing a little bit of editorial work on it, and I think putting it out as a podcast episode for their super podcast. So thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your days. Bye.
Bye-bye.